So, Tat, what you're saying is if you know what someone wants, you will be able to infer what they need. But what if someone doesn't even know what they want?
Okay. Well, it actually happens, we have come across a lot of people who, like young people, especially who are sort of like wondering, do I want to become an engineer or do I want to become an artist or do I want to be a teacher or a social worker? And they sometimes say, I don't really know, right? And then we also have come across people who are sort of like mid-career, who is going, okay, like, I got like much of the things that I need. That appears to me is like that, or I got my house, I got my car, I got my family, but somehow I do not feel satisfied. So something is missing, right? And we sometimes would actually also work with people who are older, who are sort of like regretting they have like wasted their life and haven't figured out what they really need. We also sometimes come across people who are displaced, who are going through major transitions, which we have a lot of experience with here in Canada. Like we have new immigrants coming from another country, newcomers who came here because they're displaced by war, armed conflict, poverty, what have you. And they're here and they're at a loss. And if you ask them, so what do you need? They don't know, right? So basically, we approach this situation by bringing together two perspectives. One is the kind of very basic human needs that we assume everyone would have, just to varying degrees. Right? Say, for example, you need a shelter, you need an income in a place like Canada, right, to get your food. Basically, your subsistence or biological subsistence is something that we can safely assume that most people would need. So if we have like refugees, newcomers to the country who haven't actually been able to find housing or doesn't have an income, they may or may not be aware. It may or may not even be the priority. We try to get them, say, for example, health coverage. Right? Some people don't really feel that like I need this, I need the job first, right? But when we explain to them, well, you need a health insurance card. It is not controversial. It is like, like people would agree, yes, they do. So, but I think this is the health insurance card actually is a good example, right? So what is a need, right? Very often is contingent upon the social reality that you're in. People living in this country, in Canada, will automatically assume that, well, everyone needs health insurance, but we understand very well that, like in many parts of the world, health insurance is not even available. But we can safely assume that when people get into like medical difficulties or their things are not functioning well with their body, most people would feel the need to like remedy that, right? To correct that. So what I'm saying is that there's a set of needs that we assume that most human beings have. Like we have the biological ones, like we say like you need food, you need shelter. And there are a couple of like very fundamental biological needs that we always take that everyone would need. And sometimes the person may not even be aware. So one of them, of course, is the need for rest. And you can easily tell that like if someone is not sleeping well, someone has like a disturbed sleep pattern, then the need for rest is not met. The need for rest is actually an everyday English kind of way to express a deeper concept, which is sort of like more biological, right? We were actually referring to a physiological or biological cycle that healthy human beings would have to go through, and it involves restoring equilibrium or homeostasis to your biological system through a period of activity and a period of rest. And in everyday language, we talk about, like you're not having enough rest. But actually what we're referring to is to allow your body as a biological system to get into a healthy cycle so that it can keep returning to a natural, normal state of homeostasis. So that is like, sort of like the two different ways of talking about the same thing. The other need, biological need, that a lot of people tend to ignore, and most people recognize like oxygen, water, and food, right? But this like rest is something that some people do not recognize. The other one is stimulation. So stimulation for our brain is actually important to keep the brain functioning normally. During the Korean War, the American military discovered something very dramatic. That were like American soldiers were captured by the Soviets and they got brainwashed. So brainwashing was a term that was created during that period, and many people do not understand what it is. Brainwashing actually is achieved by depriving your brain or your nervous system of stimulation. Right? This is what the Soviets did to capture the American soldiers. They were like put in like a floating situation in a pool, and then they're blindfolded and they're straitjacketed, so they do not receive any kind of sensory input or stimulation from the outside. And once you're in that state, your brain will literally become starving for stimulation. And whatever information or stimulation is fed to you when you're in that like sensory deprivation state would be something that is overwhelmingly gratifying. So if I'm like whispering to you in a soft voice about another political ideology, your system will gladly receive that and incorporate that. So this is an interesting experience. And then like during the 60s, a lot of cognitive psychologists, social psychologists in the States especially, were doing a lot of research on this. And that was also the time when the what is now known as the CIA, back then it was known as the OSS, the Office for Strategic Services. They actually did some experiments on that too, right? And those would be classified, I think in the 60s, and psychologists were picking up on that line of research, and then they discovered the significance of stimulation. During around the same time, it was actually a little bit earlier, like another psychologist, is just like more working in the clinical area, not associated with military, not in any formal sense that I know of anyways, John Bowlby, was also discovering something similar, but using a different sample. Like, so John Bowlby was working with infants in nurseries, or what the British called creche, the people who were taken care of by people other than their own parents. And many of them were not receiving sufficient stimulation, like sensory, tactile, visual, auditory, what have you. And Bowlby was able to observe, unfortunately, like quite a few of them were not developing normally. And later research has found that if babies are not given adequate information, that actual brain mass or brain size would actually be significantly smaller than babies would do. So those are just like different ways of looking at how important stimulation is for us biologically. And I just want to add this to our list, right? Like when you talk to people, what are our biological needs for survival? People will say like water, oxygen, food, shelter. But I think many people do not aware that rest and stimulation are equally important. And associated with this actually is another piece that can be seen as like part of stimulation, but it's actually not quite exactly the same. So what am I talking about? Can you guess? Okay, it is activity. So if you imagine yourself being bound, right, to like a chair or a bed, and you're not allowed to move, what I can tell you is that like your body and your brain are going to literally rot, right? And you probably have heard that horror stories about human beings being put in those kind of situations. So actually, the human body and the human brain both require a certain amount, minimal amount of activity to stay healthy, so that it can function. An inadequate amount of activity is obviously unhealthy, right? So if we put all these together, these are the kind of needs that we think are important for any human being, whether they're aware or not. So one example that I can give you in SSLD practice, which is like based on this like understanding, is like when we work with people with dementia, the first thing that I noticed when I started working with like people with dementia a few years ago was the inadequate stimulation that they're exposed to. And that led me to design a program, right, that specifically addressed their needs of stimulation and activity. And it has been demonstrated to be very successful over the last few years. And I have to say, like, unfortunately, around the world, in most places that are supposedly providing service to people who have been diagnosed with dementia, more often than not, people are not getting sufficient stimulation. It's like we are starving them of stimulation and activity. If we're starving people of like food and water, we'll be accused of abuse, right? And there would be like legal, criminal consequences. But unfortunately, like society has not waken up to this reality yet. We are actually routinely depriving people of stimulation and activity. And in my opinion, that is abuse, right? I hope more people would agree with me, and this is why I'm using this example here. So coming back to your question, how do we determine people's needs and when they're not aware? So the examples that I've just given you, you probably appreciate, tells us that, like, you know, this is one perspective. This is what I call the objective perspective, like coming from the outside. Someone from the outside can sort of objectively determine what you may need, and this is usually built on research, right, among other human beings. So that is like one major perspective. And if you push this perspective a little bit forward, you can say that there are other human needs that you can safely assume that most people would have, such as, like, you know, according to the example that I gave earlier, by work done by Bowlby, which actually was later on picked up by some Canadian psychologists here, right, including people like Ainsworth. And it contributed to the development of this well-known theory in psychology known as attachment theory. So we basically argue that human beings need to form meaningful attachment with other human beings for them to grow and develop healthily, both in terms of their physical and psychological and social being. So that is another sort of like generally assumed need. So if you follow this logic, then we can like then generate a list of needs, right, that we believe that every human being should have, like including attachment, and then soon enough we can be adding to it, like, you know, things like safety, security, affiliation, intimacy, the need for pleasure, and need for accomplishment, need for self-esteem, and all that. But soon enough, you discover, well, there's a problem with that, because if you're following this like objective checklist kind of approach, right, then it doesn't really add much for us to understand individual behaviors. Because like if you say that like people's behaviors are driven by needs, and everyone has the same needs, and like how come that they're behaving differently, right? And how come some people are aware and some people are not aware, right? So this is like the limitation of what we call the objective needs theory. One of the best known varieties is actually Abraham Maslow's idea of hierarchy of needs, and then he he argued that human beings have the same set of needs, and then there's arranged in a hierarchical order, and when your basic biological needs are met, and then you go up to the more psychosocial needs, and then eventually you get up to the top of the pyramid, then you'll be looking more for self-actualization and transcendence. Obviously, in real life, a lot of people never get to the higher levels, and then for some people, they're able to forego some of the very basic biological needs in order to strive for some more psychosocial or personal needs. Right? Some people can literally starve themselves because they want to look slimmer, and if you ask why do they want to look slimmer, it may be that they have a very poor self-image. They need approval from others in order to carry on. But some people want to look slimmer because they believe in a certain idea, right? Some people, they refuse to eat not because they want to look slimmer. They want to be punishing people around them. They may also be angry at themselves. So you see the same person doing the same thing, and it reflects a different range of needs. So if we get into specific situations like this, then we know that a totally objective checklist kind of approach to needs is of limited help. That's useful, but it doesn't answer specific individual questions. So we need to put in another perspective. That is what we call the subjective perspective. Well, the subjective perspective is that the person himself or herself, going through life, will have a different awareness, a different sense of what his or her needs are. And then the earlier question that you raised regarding, okay, what if I don't even know what I want? Some people actually do not, right? So, and I would say, well, actually, in most situations, people do not know, right? And we started off with this general position that a lot of people do not know what they need. Well, hopefully they have some idea of what they want. And then we can try to infer what they need from what they want. And then we also have gone to the place now that we know that there are people who cannot even tell you clearly what they want. Or what they want is it's constantly flipping. And they get confused themselves. Right? I seem to want this badly yesterday, and then I wake up this morning, I'm not interested anymore, right? So we have people who are sort of shifting from one set of wants to another, right? And those are actually, to me, the more fascinating, interesting cases. So maybe I can start with a few basic principles here, and then see how we can move further. One of the things that we try to do in the SSLD model is to look at the checklist, right? And start with a slightly different perspective than most of those what I call generic need theorists like Maslow, is to first recognize that each human being may have a different profile of needs. So meaning that Maslow assumes that the basic needs are more important, and then after you've met your basic needs, you move to a higher level. Our approach is very different. Our approach is each individual is different. And for some people, right, very early on in life, even their basic needs are not met, they are constantly striving towards say achievement, esteem, or self-actualization. And they do not mind, going through physical hardship or being starved and going by without enough food or money or water or whatever. So we know of people like that. And then we know of people who are wealthy, who are established, who have a lot of power, who have a lot of friends and everything, but they never get up to the higher level, right? And some of these people might, even when many of the needs are met, they find themselves indulging, right, in maybe good food, I don't know, very straightforward sensory pleasure. So you have people like that as well. So they do not always move up the pyramid. So we believe that a profile approach is probably more realistic. So a profile approach basically says that each person has a different profile. So for person A, maybe esteem and affiliation are more important. For person B, maybe physical comfort, security are more important. For person C, maybe like self-actualization and the capacity to do good, affiliation and vicarious gratification through empathic engagement and helping other people are important. So when you have people with different profiles, right, they need different things, right? So that is like the first step for understanding human needs. The second step is to recognize that these profiles do change. So your need profile as a child will not be exactly the same when you're older. Obviously, in my line of work, like doing psychotherapy, I obviously sometimes see people who have like an unmet need that has become the sort of the theme of this person's life. So that I've come across individuals who basically have gone through decades of their life, a good part of their life, needing the same thing, but that need is never adequately addressed. And can be a need for self-affirmation, need for esteem, need for affiliation, or intimacy, or love, right? So that can be very strong throughout a person's life. And for other people, it would be the need to dominate, to control, and after many years of life, and even after achieving material success or social success, for many people, this need is never adequately addressed. Right, so you can easily imagine people, right, in this like prototypical profiles that I described. But the key idea here is that the need profile, right, is different for each individual, and even with the same individual, some aspects can stay constant, but some aspects could change, right? And the change is very often associated with your changing circumstances in life. And what we hope will happen in SSLD is that it change because you've learned, right? Because you've learned the best possible strategies and skills to address your needs, and then you can sort of like get to a different level. And the ideal state for us is for people to achieve a sense of what we call self-efficacy. That is a state in which you know what you need, and you're able to set realistic goals for yourself, and you're also competent in realizing those goals.